Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers. Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. We are 53 days away from the election, and it is hard to believe it has been 19 years since the attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the thwarted attack above a rural town in Pennsylvania. It did change our American world, from the illusion of peace and prosperity to global catastrophe, followed by global crisis. We went to endless war, economic calamity, and the collapse of neoliberal brainwashing. And it turns out that 9/11 was just the first crisis. There were two more to come, three if you count Donald Trump. In 2008, reckless bankers kicked over the financial house of cards and knocked down the global economy. The unaddressed economic pain gave Trump an opening to win the presidency. And then in December of 2019, a virus began spreading and became the worst global health crisis in 100 years. Leaders, including Trump, bungled a response, and the health crisis plunged us into an economic crisis, hard to imagine, even worse than 2008. And so here we are looking out at the world, as Langston Hughes said, and wondering what to do in the face of what we remember. What are the lessons of 9/11 and of the repeated traumas of the first 20 years of the 21st century? First is about pre-existing conditions. Each of these crises was made far worse by inequities left unaddressed, systemic economic and racial gaps that transformed initial shock into nightmares for some of us. Black Americans and poor Americans died more in our endless wars. Black Americans and poor Americans lost their homes and wealth more in the economic collapse, and Black Americans and poor Americans lost their jobs more and died more in the pandemic. But there's more. In each of these calamities, we knew that trouble was coming. At least some people knew and couldn't find a way to warn us. Before 2001, Osama bin Laden and his band were already known for their desire to strike the West, and the World Trade Center had already been bombed before. Before 2008, it was no secret that Wall Street was packaging mortgages and exotic financial bundles that concealed the risk. Some people, of course, got rich by betting this would collapse. Before 2020, the public health world knew that a great pandemic would come. There were books written, there were movies made, and of course Donald Trump told Bob Woodward it was here in February. Yet again, for the third time in 20 years, we are suffering through a calamity we knew was coming and yet could not seem to stop. Okay, once is tragedy, twice is a coincidence, 3 times means the system is broken by design, and we need to change it. So how is that going? Not great, sorry to say. Oh, we've occupied and we've marched and we've posted and we've canceled. But what have we actually changed? Because change is harder. For that, we need thoughtful, strategic organizing. We need to keep winning power. We need to take over the government and legislate. How we feel won't do the job. Even expressing how we feel won't do the job. Using how we feel to motivate us to work and organize strategically, that is going to bring us the change. And let's be real, the clock is ticking. We know this. This past 19 years, the years most of us grew up in, have created 2 generations in which only know crisis and failed leadership. But if the world doesn't change, it's going to get worse. While we have been social distancing, the climate has lashed out. The next crisis is going to be even bigger than the last 3, and my guess, they will compound. Government, humans, the planet can only handle so much at once. If you think this pandemic was brutal, think about a pandemic plus a world with tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, fleeing floods and fires and all the ravages of climate change. That could be, and probably will be, the next 20 years, because it's already happening. We don't have the strongest leadership examples. So we will have to immediately rise to leadership if we want to ensure a government that can respond to these crises and support its people in the face of these crises. We are either solving these problems or worsening them. There's no in between. Have I got your attention? Good. Because we have a very special 9/11 show for you. So long as you remember that as much as we want you to watch, we want you to act, and we want to show you the path to act. Right feelings are no substitute for right actions. So here are some stories topping my newsfeed today. There were almost as many mail ballots as in-person ballots cast in Tuesday's primaries in Rhode Island. Final results were in last night, and they confirmed a major triumph for Rhode Island Political Cooperative, a left movement committed to cracking the Democratic machine control of Rhode Island's legislature. And it looks like they've done it. The president of the Senate barely survived, and the final count of mail-in ballots confirmed last night that 2 of his top lieutenants were defeated. That brings to 10 the seats taken by candidates supported by the cooperative. This is huge, as tiny Rhode Island has one of the most entrenched Democratic machines in the country. So great work, guys. We got to duplicate that everywhere, and it is doable with these coalitions. Today, the 9/11 ceremony in New York produced a very strange encounter. Joe Biden and Mike Pence were there and exchanged an elbow bump. Can we roll that clip real quick? Do we have that clip of Mike Pence and Biden? Oh, nope, we don't have it. Sorry about that, guys. So they basically were there at the 9/11 memorial, which happens every year. And the 2 former, I guess they've both been vice president and they're running against each other, had cordial interactions through a fist bump. We're going to talk about 9/11 with Harry Siegel. He is a great columnist for the New York Daily News and is in New York City and is an editor at the Daily Beast. He'll share his thoughts on the lessons of 9/11 and the pandemic. And later we have Josh Fox in the house, and also, for return, Joshua Kahn Russell. All that is ahead after this break, and while we are away, please make sure to smash that like button and subscribe on YouTube. Share with us everywhere. That's how we grow. Special thanks to our patrons. Join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. I will be back right after this. Thanks for watching and listening to the Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. We have an old friend. I used to host a show on SiriusXM. Some of you might know that. And our next guest was a regular on that show, a very popular regular on the show, SiriusXM Progress, Harry Siegel. Harry Siegel is an editor at the Daily Beast. He is a columnist at the New York Daily News. He is the co-host of FAQ NYC. If you're into New York politics, I love the show. I mean, I have a lot of opinions about some of the guests, but I love the show because I love you and I love your analysis. So welcome to the Nomiki Show, your inaugural visit.
Hello, thanks for having me with visual.
Where are you? You're outside somewhere?
I am. My older daughter is having a music lesson, which I had not realized, so I had to flee the house.
You mean you're not teaching the music lesson like everybody else is teaching their kids how to, becoming teachers, basically?
Oh my goodness! So much respect for teachers, as we're all bootlegging that. No, my 8-year-old just keeps mocking me. Oh, you don't know the notes? I don't know anything.
You don't know calculus? You don't know algebra? Nope, forgot that. Mm-hmm. So Harry, I'm really happy you could join us today because to me, you're one of these, there really aren't many out there, if any, like New York reporters who has this very special, I can't quite, I was trying to sum it up in words, and so forgive me for not being the most eloquent, but there's a type of reporting that existed in New York that doesn't seem to exist anymore, that had opinions, but you could never quite figure out where the person landed politically, and it might just be acknowledging facts and then basing some sort of analysis around those facts, where I feel like sometimes there's the analysis and then the gathering of facts now. Does that make sense?
It does. I think there's a real difference between like what Wayne Barrett used to do, which was relentlessly follow money and then rave about the influence that it bought, and starting off with this is my bad guy. What facts can I find to fill that in or verify where I already know I'm going? Right. And doing the first one, just sort of obsessively, grumpily, just looking all around at things that are wrong and trying to figure out what exactly is wrong is a very fun way to spend time, and endless, of course.
So, Harry, you are a New Yorker. This is 9/11. I just want to start off by asking, do you have any personal reflections from 9/11, 19 years ago today? And then I'd love to ask you some questions about just the political world that has shifted, especially in New York, since then.
So I after 9/11, I spent a bunch of time not as a reporter, at and around Ground Zero, just helping out with stuff. And that was very, very intense and strange. And one of the strange things I don't believe I noticed at the time was how quickly that all comes to seem normal. By your third day, and you're sleeping in the Brooks Brothers store, to catch a couple hours of rest and just going out and doing stuff. Taking an occasional, sort of mental break where you're vaguely just talking politics with someone in the midst of all this and, working, how quickly strange things can become normal, which I think a lot of Americans have gotten a sense of in the last few years of this administration and these wild politics. I also think it's just incredible that we're apparently having any minute now. I think it's supposed to be at 3:30, a flyover, in honor of the day. Which
what that means is they're low flying aircrafts, which is triggering. I mean, do you think there was some thought about that, or is that I hate that I have to even ask this question, or is it intentional?
The Trump administration was doing this early on in the rising coronavirus wave. Where they're like, we want to thank the first responders. So there's just going to be a ton of planes like buzzing over your city. None of this particularly bothers me. It seems really thoughtless and stupid. And I'm sure that there's people it's triggering for. I had a few years after 9/11 when, I sort of saw parts of it happen at the time where once I looked at a plane, I had to keep watching it and like, you stay, you continue. All right, you're still going. That's okay. So it does seem like a very weird way to pay tribute, to me at least.
Yeah. So, you've covered politics in New York for a long time, and in the last 20 years, this city's leadership has changed, leadership style has changed, and the city itself has changed. How have you seen the city's leadership change since 9/11?
Well, whatever happened to Rudy Giuliani?
Let's just start with that. You thought that I was going to start with Giuliani, didn't you? I was waiting till the end. Harry's an expert on Giuliani.
The city's changed. Well more than half the people who are here were not here on 9/11. Like 19 years is a long time. There are going to be people voting for president who weren't born.
Right.
When that happened. The people who are here have changed. The big shift has really been that the state has gone full California, which was in the making for a long time. But in essence, there is no Republican Party here, and all of the politics are decided within the Democratic Party framework. We just had a 20-year interregnum with Giuliani and then Bloomberg, where that sort of wasn't the case. And for almost all of that, Republicans weirdly control one branch of the state Senate. Mm-hmm. So there was like this little veto on how far things could go, both those ways. And all that is gone now. And so the everything that's happening is strictly in a democratic context, which is interesting and opens up a lot of possibilities, but also means there are a lot less sort of safety checks or need to develop a broader consensus than had been the case. And those primaries, incidentally, that now really decide all the levers of power, there are a lot less voters there. So the part of the city that is finally deciding who wields power and who controls the spoils and all that has shifted pretty dramatically, and I think without people sort of fully grokking that's happened.
I mean, it is interesting you say that the primary voters, it's a very small vote. I mean, like California, like Los Angeles, for instance, where mayoral turnout is extremely low. It is here in New York as well. Not to mention special elections, where if you can get one machine to back you, you might win. And that's not great for democracy when you're a one-party city, right? Like,
it's been weirdly good in the short term. The reason why, and it won't be in the long term, is that the semi-organized left, the herd of cats left, I guess, but the Working Families Party and the DSA in particular, they just started doing what the Democratic Party stopped doing. Because they had this little machine, there were only a handful of people going to vote, they controlled a bunch of that vote, and they could just keep the same hacks forever. And so you had often younger, often newly politically activated leftists who said that's not good enough and started knocking on doors, really organizing, talking to citizens, running for community boards, running for all these different offices, for council seats, for the state legislature, for district's attorney races that are countywide, and doing really well. So that's been nice to see. It troubles me, however, in that this group that had no power for a long time is suddenly accruing outsized power because they're bothering and doing the work. And the mainline Democrats are not. The Republicans, such as they are hideous in every sense. And like the business community that was just sort of used to being able to bribe a few people to like sort of slow down decisions they thought were not in their interest and maybe weren't in the whole city's interest has no power left. So you have one organized group that is really maximizing their position and putting in the work, which is great. I think over time that's unhealthy if you have a political leadership that's really out of sync with where the center of the city would be if people participated. But it's hard to fault the people who participated for maximizing their position in the meantime.
Well, it's not even so much. I mean, I'm a leftist. I obviously love the idea of the left gaining power in this city and talking about inequality and real estate and all these issues that have been really hard to kind of push through in a real way in the city. I mean, you can campaign on them, but to actually push through them is a different, is very different. But taking over the state senate, for instance, is a great example. For over a decade, the state senate was held up in different ways and forms, whether it was IDC or some version of that. And that's because of these industries. And so the left has been able to take over and push forward some legislation that, thank God, exists in this pandemic. Clearly not enough. But I also worry, institutions that are not checked are dangerous. You need to have some counter. And when you have this world also simultaneously where, we don't know what New York's going to look like, right? Media is in crisis. The Daily News, which you work at, is constantly laying people off and in crisis. And so when you don't have another party to check, and you don't have high turnout, and you don't have reporting, and now you are facing potentially another 20 years of economic decline as the last 19 years, it really took 19 years to revive New York. How do you see this playing out in this city with these new obstacles?
Am I allowed to curse?
Dorsey, can you say the F word? Just say up or down. No, you are not. I don't control the platform.
Acronyms. Hey, the left that's coming to power is in some senses SOL, because they're coming there right after 20 years of a constantly rising tax tide and ever more wealth. And then the questions are how you distribute it and what that means. And those are big and important questions. But governing when there's less wealth and you have to make really difficult decisions about what things you've committed to that, hey, actually, we can't afford to pay for that. When you have to take on significant debt, it is a totally different proposition. And while even 9/11 as an economic matter ended up being closer to like a car going into a ditch, this looks like a car going off a cliff for New York right now. And that's so even if there's a Democratic wave and a Biden restoration and a real bailout package for the city, that's not going to get us close to where we were anytime soon. If no one likes Midtown, Midtown is a terrible place. Office life is unpleasant. But if a lot of that is permanently or semi-permanently gone, right, that's a tremendous hit to the city and its tax base. So it's just a very difficult time to be coming to power, and our political class, and not just the people, the newly electeds and the more progressive people. Frankly, I think the whole political conversation is stuck in February.
Yeah. I mean, I subscribe to all of these emails, and there's a bunch of people who've stepped up in the last week and announced that they're running for city council, for mayor. I was really shocked to see so little focus on the crisis that we're in right now and moving forward. And it was just sort of repeated talking points, very important talking points about inequality and taxing the rich. Clearly that was a problem that we had before, and that the subway was not being funded, and that's the lifeblood of the city, and people are being driven out of their neighborhoods, and there's gentrification, and there's Hudson Yards, and all these different places. There are fights, but I think what you're describing is real. I mean, if it's bad enough that the governor is unwilling to tax his donors, where are we going to get the remaining revenue from when we already have all these broken systems, and it's just going to get far, far, far worse?
Putting the taxes to the side for just a second, and that's a big question, right? If we're having a conversation about gentrification and over-policing at a moment when the city isn't disappearing, but
Oh my God.
The city isn't disappearing. There's not a mass exodus, but Manhattan is really emptier than it was. And where we're now having more than twice as many shootings in recent months as we were a year ago, right? Then there's some bad disconnect between what's actually happening in New York and the political conversation, which again I think has to do with the most motivated people who've now put in years of work to like get to overdue reforms and are now trying to implement them in a totally different moment and context
Interesting.
that I don't think has completely penetrated those sort of their immediate feedback networks.
Yeah.
And I have great respect for ideologues and people who just hold to a position and a set of beliefs. For instance, the poor should have more, and we should tax the hell out of the rich. Are just going to hold to that through thick and thin, and in different political moments. But the context is so violently different right now, and uncertain in ways. There was a little of that right after 9/11. There was a solid year. Is the city going to come back? And a lot of that was, are more shoes going to drop? And going on 20 years later, we sort of baked in that didn't happen. We've had over policing problems and sense and like this ring of steel. And as we're speaking, right, in Manhattan, most of the police precincts, the blocks they're on, there's 22 of them. I think 18 of them are now occupied blocks with barricades and checkpoints to go in those blocks. So this is the NYPD sort of in the aftermath of police protests and the pandemic, but really the police protests just occupying parts of the city. I mean, talk about whose streets, and they're saying our streets.
Right.
And that's wild to me. There's just so much to sort out right now, and great uncertainty as to what's coming next. I hate the pessimists. I hate the New York Times and the New York Post. Everyone's leaving New York. Endless stream of articles for different reasons. The Times, because a lot of rich people are, at least for now, and the Post because they're of New York, but they sort of hate it.
Yeah.
But this is a really scary, precarious moment. And if we're still in if we're still sort of upset about gentrification and like the white return to the cities, starting in the late 80s or early 90s and going up to the present, at a moment when there really might be another wave of flight, then something is really off.
Do you think some of it, do you think they're not getting it because there has been a moratorium on evictions, and so we just don't have a real sense of what's actually about to happen? I mean, there's a bunch of projections, but it's been extended to the end of the year. No thanks to anybody in New York. I mean, is that it? Is it just that there's no visual, there's no leadership understanding? Like, I mean, I'm sure they're getting phone calls, but this is what's been stewing in my brain, and it's, we're processing this as we go. I feel as if there was a time, and I've been talking about this on the show the last few days, when even our worst enemies, at least on the left, the leaders, whether it was Koch or, as I mentioned a couple of days on the show, or beyond, they still recognized the crisis and dealt with it. And I feel as if there's just this numbness, this denial, and I don't know if that's because the machinations of city government. I felt this when I ran for office. I felt like I was running against a bunch of people that didn't read the newspaper, frankly. I'm going to be completely honest with you. How many times things got brought up, like lead poisoning, and no one knew anything. They have staff to literally cut clips for them to read it, and had no sense of just some of the basic facts of the city. And I feel like that is what I'm seeing right now in the worst way possible. Is that fair to say, or am I losing my mind?
Definitely some of that. Like, look, de Blasio is sort of checked out. He's like, New York will come out of this. New York always comes out of it. New Yorkers are... what's your plan? I'll be talking about that at some point in September. I mean, that's just checked out. It's this passive voice, we'll be fine because we'll be fine sort of thing. That's very distressing, and tonal leadership is not the...
We're losing you a little bit.
And there's an absence of that from the city in a big way. And then it's a little time warpy. I think there's been a lot of this in the Trump years. Like, these characters just never, ever go away, where it's very hard for people to absorb new information. And we're having these giant nationalized fights that make...
Harry, we're losing you a little bit.
Specific questions. With lead paint in particular, uh-oh, is that any better? With
yes,
lead
it's just freezing
in particular,
up. Mm-hmm.
It's not a secret. It's just insanely expensive to deal with. And because it's expensive to deal with, and there's no satisfying way to deal with it, everyone for many, many, many years just tried to avoid that issue. I can't be more specific, but I did Oppo research many years ago, 20 years ago, about someone who'd been on the city council for 25 years. And he'd been in all the lead paint votes, right? And he voted the wrong way on some of them. And these were some of the only contested city council votes, and they were big, hotly argued issues, again, because the money involved was so massive. And it's so much easier to just paint over it and not think about it. But eventually that paint chips, and kids eat it, and it tastes like sugar, and it does tremendous damage. So we did an ad with a baby just looking cute and by a wall and playing, and then the baby falls over, and it says, "This politician, voted to kill your child." And
wow.
The candidate did not let that ad run, somewhat sensibly, but it wasn't entirely wrong. These are just very simple money and values things. If you really care about children getting poisoned and having brain damage and very different lives, you have to deal with this paint. And that's a tremendous amount of money, and you have to find it somewhere. And the honest answer from our political class over many decades now has been, we don't care that much. We're going to see if it changes now with the left wielding some real power in the state level and in the city.
Interesting. Harry, before we wrap up, just a basic question: is New York done?
New York's a giant place. It will remain a giant place. New York is awesome. There's all sorts of opportunities in New York right now because people are saying. And New York's never going to be done, but I think we're in for a really lengthy, painful stretch. And I'm worried that you're going to see all sorts of cynics taking advantage of that to announce happily the death in New York. And I hope those people have slow, painful experiences themselves, because that's just a nasty thing to root for. And I'm sure if they are around to see it, that they'll be wrong.
Well, hopefully there are economic protections put in place so that our most vulnerable citizens of New York and whatever middle class exists in New York still, probably not a middle class that would reflect the rest of the country because it's so expensive to live here, that they're protected as well so that they can keep their homes and take care of their families, and that we have the vibrancy, the art, the culture, the restaurants, the things that we care about. Harry Siegel, thanks for joining us. Would love to have you back on. Talk more New York.
Having me. It's been fun.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
All right. Up next, we have the two Joshes. We have Joshua Kahn Russell and Josh Fox. Up after this break, we're going to talk more about 9/11 and New York with some more New Yorkers. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Wow, rookie mistake just now. Didn't unmute my mic. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show for our special 9/11 coverage. This is a special day, and we wanted to reflect on the last 19 years, especially as we face these crises that are just compounding. Much of it has been caused, I think, built upon the last 19 years. So I'm excited to have two good friends, join today. We have Joshua Kahn Russell. He's an organizer, a campaign strategist, a nonviolent direct action coordinator. I'm just going to read some of the great stuff about him. He's described as a social movement facilitator that has trained thousands of activists across the globe. He's the executive director of the Wildfire Project, an organization that helps grassroots groups transform their culture, build power, practice freedom, face challenging dynamics, and win. He's been on before. We know him well. And we have Josh Fox, film director, playwright, environmental activist. He was nominated for an Oscar, as we all know, for Gasland, and then he produced Gasland 2, The Truth Has Changed, How to Let Go of the World, and Awake. He's also the host of Staying at Home with Josh Fox. I need to come up with... That was kind of fun. I actually liked doing that to you.
That was great.
Guys, this is going to be fun, so I have to set some parameters. I know we love to talk, so we have about 20 minutes to talk about a very, very big set of topics. So I want to start off with both of you with reflections on 9/11 itself. I think it's important, especially with an audience that is pretty much our age and younger, to talk about what it was like in those days, because we were witnesses to it and old enough to really register it. I mean, Joshua and I were just old enough, but Josh, let's go to you first. Josh Fox.
And which Josh with glasses do you want to talk to first? I took off my glasses just to sort of differentiate life. So first of all, let me just say it's great to be on the show. It's great to see you both. 9/11 is a really hard day. I recount a whole story of what happened to me during 9/11 in my book, The Truth Has Changed, and also in the film version of that, which we're doing a clip of on my show. But, my most vivid memories of 9/11 were of the next day, which is when my whole theater company, I was running a theater company, running an all-day, all-night, 7-day-a-week workshop with 80 actors and 10 directors, and all at this Wow House, our place in Brooklyn called the Wow House. And so we had to locate all of our people. We had a couple of actors who actually temped in the World Trade Center. I used to work in the World Trade Center. I worked in the World Trade Center up until about 3 months before 9/11 as a gardener, believe it or not. I took care of plants on 3 different floors for different hedge funds, and plants. We hated going to the World Trade Center. We actually used to call it the Death Star, because plants in there would die like you've never seen plants die before in your entire life. You'd walk through, you'd come in there, and you'd there'd be somebody yelling into a phone, angry, frustrated, capitalism, and you'd walk in the room with the gardening greens on, and they would say things like, "Why the hell is that plant dying?" And you'd say, well, you've got it on an air conditioning vent. It belongs on a tropical island, and you're yelling at it. No, we wouldn't say that. We would just sort of say, well, that's okay. We'll get you a new one. Right. So I actually was thinking about all of the people that I knew in the building, all the watering cans, all the plants, all the art. There was great art in the World Trade Center. And of course, it's just beyond surreal. But I spent the whole day locating all my friends. I had a friend named Patrick McCaffrey, whose job was directly underneath the World Trade Center. We finally called him at 4 a.m. He had done the night shift, so he got off at 8 a.m. And he said, Josh, they blew up my job. He said, I hated that job, but I didn't want them to blow it up, which was sort of, I think, a little bit of how a lot of New Yorkers felt. But the truth of the matter is that 9/11 and the year after 9/11 was a moment where New York was at its most alive, most raw, most awake, and most troubled. You could look into the eyes of anyone on any subway platform, and you could see instantly a weeping that was there, and a grief that was there, and a community and a commiseration. And that this sense that we were going to not let this be an injury to us. However, what happened was immediately we saw American flags all over New York City. We never had American flags in New York City, right? Stars and stripes were in the newspapers. You're supposed to cut them out and put them in the window. It was the moment New York was attacked by radical extremists, killing 3,000 of us. But it was also the moment when the colonizers came to New York, and those colonizers were George Bush and the capitalists and the mega corporations. We didn't have mega corporations all across New York City 20 years ago. We had a small smattering of them in Times Square, where Giuliani had opened up the hatchet man for globalization. And we had a brutalization during Giuliani of gentrification at the hands of the street crime unit. So to see these people who were ripping our city apart, who were racist, who were violent, who were gentrifiers, who were destroying the culture of the city, all of a sudden be celebrated by the rest of the world was truly surreal. And to have George Bush show up and stand on the rubble with the Iron Cross behind him, and then start two wars, which, by the way, most New Yorkers were against, it felt like the ultimate betrayal and ultimate takeover. So when I think about 9/11, I don't just think about the event, which was horrific and have incredible sense memory to this day still of bringing water and pizza and food down to the first responders in the clouds of acrid smoke and eyes peeling and being in front of the towers, literally a block in front on the morning of September the 13th and trapped between the press and the burning towers, what was left of them. I have visceral memories of trauma. But actually more traumatic was what happened after. What we watched our grief be turned into a jingoistic rage war machine, which killed millions of people in our names. And it was our job to say, no, not in our names. And that's our job today, I think, as New Yorkers who survived it, to make sure that we don't drown in the commemoration of our horror and trauma. But we also recognize the fact that we allowed revenge and political manipulation to define the next 2 decades, and that is unacceptable. I know that was a wide-ranging answer.
No, it leads right into why I wanted to have Joshua on as well, talking about this, because last time Joshua came on, you talked about your activism that really, the activism, not just yours, the activism that came out of 9/11 and into the 2004 Iraq 2004 convention, and the organizing, in protest of the Iraq War. So Joshua, I mean, you're a New Yorker. You're not there now. You're in Northern California, but want to share your experience, and we can kind of get into some of the lessons learned.
Yeah, I'll just pick up where Josh number one left off.
He's born before you. That's why he's number one.
Yeah, exactly.
I can be any number.
There's
number 7.
But where you were just talking about grief and trauma and the exploitation of trauma, which is the main way that I think about both 9/11 and the moment that we're in now. One thing that feels eerily similar. So I was a senior in high school, and I grew up in a Connecticut suburb right outside of New York, and I do remember one thing that moment shifted for me was feeling suddenly like history wasn't a thing in books, that it was something that was actively happening and that we were an active part of. I had never really taken that in until that moment, really. And, the response of revenge that you were just describing, Josh, strikes me as just, the immaturity of our nation to react of like, so we were attacked on mainland soil, and which is a violation. There's a level of that's independent of the amount of deaths that happen, right? Mm-hmm. And then in response, what did we do? We blamed a country that didn't do it.
Right.
We created a framework for endless war. We killed 3 countries. Yeah. And we basically created a framework that said the enemy is whoever we get to say it is forever, and terrorism, right? We killed 500,000 civilians. 7,000 U.S. soldiers. I don't even know how many, Iraqi soldiers or Afghani soldiers. And then, the Cost of War projects just came out with this accounting that there was 37 to 59 million refugees that we created in the global war on terror. We created ICE. We created the Patriot Act, unveiling
Homeland Security. Right.
Yep, Homeland Security Department. So all of this is a trauma response, right? And which, to me, I see as a result of there was no genuine collective grieving. It was a nation immature enough to leap over that part and get to action. And right now, there is no collective grieving in our nation for 200,000 COVID deaths. There is no collective grieving for the fact that California is on fire. And I mean, like, Nomi, last time I was on the show, which was 2 weeks ago, I mentioned there was ash falling from the sky outside my window. There is today too.
Yeah.
And so but the difference between that time and this time also for me is also the strength of social movements is much greater now than it was back then. The main pivot for me on 9/11 was really when I shifted from an activist to an organizer. And what I mean by that is that, you know, an activist is someone who uses their voice to try to make change. And an organizer is someone who tries to get a lot of other people to do that, right? Where it's not about you and your voice. It's about how can I create infrastructure and create momentum and campaigns that can that can move people, and shifting your orientation to activating others. That was that moment for me. And it was the anti-war movement that followed in response to, you know, George Bush bombing Iraq in, you know, especially around 2003 when it was heating up. And at that point, I was a student activist in college. And remember on that February 15th, I coordinated a student strike. So we shut down our campus. It was Brandeis University. We marched into Boston, and there was hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets with us. And for me, I got politicized after the WTO moment of the global justice era. And that was the first moment for me that I was like, oh, our politics can be popular. Like it shifted me out of this kind of subcultural mindset
right.
of feeling like, you know,
I remember the exact same feeling. This used to be, you know, this is the beginnings of the internet, and I'd have to like go find these blogs, and I felt kind of guilty looking at them because I was like, is this, are they gonna, and then you remember the papers, the street papers. I mean, it's a whole different
the indie media days. Yeah. I mean,
the real indie media days.
Yeah. The literal. Yeah. And
so just to pivot off that for a second, because I think, there was a collective trauma that was never dealt with. Americans, you know, there's a reason why we have a mourning process. Through that mourning process, and several religions do this in different ways, but you kind of are. It's the mourning. The actual process of it is you're actually processing the experience and what comes out of it, right? At least in my tradition, that's how we perceive it. So, I think what was interesting about what you said, though, is there was grief, but there was also just that it was caused by grief. I actually want to pivot back. I don't actually think it was caused by grief. All these reactions, I don't think it was because people were feeling anger and hostility. Maybe some people did that voted on some things, but I think those who were the architects of the responses saw an economic opportunity, and they're just distinctly evil people in my mind, because just as right now Donald Trump is screaming law and order, you know that what comes with law and order is a financial opportunity, and what comes with that also is people fleeing cities again, opening up another economic opportunity and vulture capitalism, and you know there's just so many different effects. So Josh, go ahead.
Can I comment on that?
Of course.
So I recently had a conversation with Reverend Barber about what was different about the George Floyd protests and why it felt in the beginning, let's say in June, where there was this gigantic outpouring in this wave. And he said, if I might be a preacher for a moment, this is grief. And it's not just grief for Black Lives Matter and all the crimes of police brutality. He was saying this is the grief of coronavirus as well. People have to grieve together. And I thought that was so important to say and fascinating, that we were out, that these protests in the streets now are also motivated by our collective desire to have a grieving process with us, right? Why did I have to be there? Why did everybody have to be there? You had to show up. And if it was not apparent from the rest of the country's reaction to 9/11, what I will say is this: the most astounding and incredible and emotional and unexpected and populist protests that I've ever witnessed in New York City were those against the Iraq War. Yeah. And that was that moment of grief. March 15th, 2003, when I showed up to this protest thinking that it was going to be, you know, and I think there was there were two of them. One of them was like a march and the other one was a rally. The rally was supposed to be a few blocks near the United Nations. And that's on the east side, if you don't know New York City. There's 6 avenues between Broadway and the United Nations. And there are obviously hundreds of streets that go across. And I showed up and I said, I'm at 50th Street and 2nd Avenue, and people were in their cars. They were not prepared. They had not shut down streets. There were not adequate nothing. People were literally stuck in their cars for the entire East Side was covered from 14th Street to 96th Street to from 1st Avenue to Broadway. Wow. Was full. And they had planned for 1 avenue and 10 blocks. This was 7 avenues and nearly 60 or 80 blocks, right? And that was the grief. And you felt it, and you felt this, not just grief, but righteous indignation that this was not to happen in our names. And when you said, Josh, you said the line that everyone said, which are attacked on our own soil. No. New York is an island off the coast of America. It was up until that point. We had been disavowed. We are the most diverse city in the world. We are the most diverse city in the world. I'll say that again.
2 boroughs are more diverse. Yep.
It is an international capital of the world. To call it American is an annexation itself. But that was the moment when I believed that we were colonized, we were appropriated, and that was what we felt so horrible about that. It was not just grief, it was also this, what the hell are you doing here? Like, and then to make another point of it, George W. Bush put the Republican convention in Madison Square Garden.
Okay, so leading into that, that's a perfect, we have about 5 minutes left just to put this to the show, and then for those of you who are patrons, you're going to get an extra segment so we can continue this conversation. So go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show if you want to hear that part. But Joshua, you were there at Madison Square Garden, and you told part of the story last time you were on, but you know, in the framework of 9/11 and this moment and kind of the moment we're going into, describe that. I mean, that was George W. Bush picking Madison Square Garden to hold a convention. What was organizing like there?
Yeah. Can I respond to something earlier and maybe talk about Madison Square Garden in the after show?
I was there too.
Oh, guys, teaser. Gotta sign up
let's
now.
Get into that day.
You're gonna miss it if you don't sign up.
Because I both want to respond to what you were saying about grief earlier, Nomi, and then also that February 15th moment that you were talking about, Josh, which is that, you know, to me, grieving is an antidote to that contracted trauma response of revenge, right? And so it's because it wasn't like we were in grief so the United States attacked these countries. No, what you said, Nomi, is correct, that grief was capitalized on by, you know, the Bush administration in a savvy way. And in general, the capitalism is very good at exploiting grief. And social movements are getting more literate about that now.
Right.
But have it like, so to arc back to that day, you know, I remember, you know, I was in Boston for that protest that you just described, Josh, and it was so empowering feeling for me. I was so excited. There were so many, I'd never been around so many human beings in my life. And at the end of the day, one of my friends came up to me and was like, yeah, that was fun, but you know, what did we really accomplish? And I was like, what do you mean? What did we really accomplish? And, you know, I was like, we built all these networks and we built all these relationships and we came out and we got wall-to-wall media coverage. And she was like, no. What I'm saying is, how does you coordinating a student strike and skipping classes for a day put pressure on the Bush administration or the Pentagon to end the war? And I had no answer for that. And that was a pivotal shift in my life to start thinking about strategy very differently. And after that period, I started, you know, when I was starting to train activists around direct action, around protest, around civil disobedience, I would ask activists to raise their hand, like, who's been to a demonstration and left feeling like, well, that was fun, but what did we accomplish? And the lessons that I drew from that are around goal setting, which is that we can do street actions that are primarily about us, that are primarily to build our networks, you know, they have an organizing function to build the movements, but you need to actually communicate those goals to your base, because if you don't, there's other ways that we do protests that actually have an instrumental pressure that we're trying to leverage on a target. And this wasn't that. And because of that, we didn't organize with any clear objective. So on that day, our banners said things like, you know, F George Bush, right? If we had recognized this country is in trauma and confused and being exploited by warmongers right now, how can we speak to those people right now? we wouldn't have banners that said F George Bush. Right. That was about us. Those banners, who was that audience? Ourselves.
That's right.
Right? And it's okay to sometimes have yourself be the audience for your action if that's what you're doing on purpose. But I learned from that day that if we were oriented towards trauma, we would have been asking totally different questions in how we designed that work and how we built that movement. And it was because a lot of us were young people just getting organized without mentorship from other movements. And that to me is why it's so exciting that in this moment right now, I think it's because we are such a movement-full moment that there are real elders that are saying, hey, pay attention to what's being lost right now. Pay attention to grief and mourning right now so that you can meet people in their hearts in a way that we can actually start to envision a different world rather than just giving expression to your reaction, right? Because that's what the administration wants. That's what they're capitalizing on.
So this is a perfect, we have to wrap up. Let's just hold tight, hold your thought. But I'm so glad that you articulated what I start off the show articulating in a very different, beautiful way. And I think it was the perfect bookmark for the show. So, it's not just expressing, it's using that expression into action so that they don't use your expression into their action. Mm-hmm. And when leadership is not there, because we're lacking leadership right now, I think we all agree that. There's some, but not enough. When you're lacking leadership with specific goals and like you said, you have to be goal-oriented as a leader, then they'll take advantage of that. And so we as a movement also, just like leaders have to set their goals and articulate what they believe in, Joe Biden, we as a movement also have to do that. So we're going to wrap up right now. I just want to do a couple of shout outs to our YouTube chat, our super chat. And then we'll be back after the break. So you guys will go to the green room and we'll be back for our patrons. Thanks, guys. All right. Special shout out to Pencil Polly. The reaction by Muslim nations to 9/11 was very supportive to the U.S., and it was an opportunity for better relations with Muslims, but was thrown away. Yes, and of course we talked about this Terry Siegel briefly, spying on Muslims, the Muslim surveillance program, the Patriot Act. I mean, we could go on, and there's a continuous legacy of that and fear in the United States Democratic Party as well. Zencat, congratulations on your first week. Love the show. Thank you. Jonathan Tipton Myers, Josh Fox. Why is no one talking about EB5 millionaire visas? We can talk about that. And how the cash-inflated stock market destroyed major cities and powers the 99%. 100%. EB5 is a fascinating, that maybe we'll bring on an expert to talk about that specifically, because it's a little wonky, I think, for most people, and they're not aware of it. But even just the visa program, last 30 years of who's been able to immigrate to the U.S. has been more so beyond 30 years, but it's been financially based. And every time they set a new immigration program, it just makes it more difficult for folks to move here without having finances in their pocket before, and having folks here on the ground who have finances. So that's our immigration program today. And that's our show for today. We will see you next week on Tuesday, 3 o'clock Eastern. Thank you for our first week. I think we did a great job. We'll be back in a studio setting very soon. So thanks for the patience and and my managing all this. But thank you to Joshua and Josh, and to Harry Siegel, and of course our whole team, and for Dorsey, who is producing right now. We'll see you next week. Stay well.